I want to speak to what Coutts was. It was a gathering of truckers, mainly farmers. Eventually, farmers bolstered the ranks, but it was a group of and the perception around Coutts, unfortunately, due to the discovery of the guns and such, has tainted what Coutts was. And for me, what's important is that we were there to demand that our representatives communicate with us like they are obligated to do, and like what had not been happening. And there's lots of different events during those days that I almost think it was like a chess game between the RCMP and the protesters. But unfortunately, we were never able to enter in official communication with the government. But looking back at the political state of affairs in Alberta, it might have been better for the Kennett government to actually have done that. And because at the end of the day, we're Albertans and we're Canadians. And the COVID restrictions and the mandates, they messed with our lives. Like we see the inconsistencies of the experts, and I don't necessarily blame them. The information provided was what they went off of, and that information is at times now no longer factual either. Things, the ball kept on getting pushed further down the road. 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and look at where we are now. And I'm not going to speak to COVID, and I'm no expert on it, but even the experts got it wrong. And for public trust to be regained, for the trust of Albertans to be regained, there has to be accountability.
Sydney Fizzard for Rebel News, and we are here at the Public Order Emergency Commission. Now, over the last couple of days, we've seen the mayor of Coutts. We're starting to see enforcement officers related to the events of Coutts. And of course, Marco Van Huigenbos, one of the individuals on September 16th, RCMP alleged him to be a key participant of the Coutts Blockade and consequently have given him a charge of mischief over $5,000, along with Alex and George.
Now, you may remember that the Coutts Blockade was one of the largest protests Alberta has ever seen in protest against vaccine mandates and COVID restrictions, not only federally, but as well a multitude of provincial restrictions that had been applied. And so, starting as a slow roll, demonstrators in support of the Freedom Convoy that was making its way to Ottawa at the same time decided to protest a little closer to home. After slow rolls occurred at the border crossing near Coutts, Alberta, it eventually turned into a blockade, which forced the lifting of COVID restrictions in Alberta and acted as a catalyst for Premier Jason Kenney's stepping down as the UCP leader.
And we have a crowdfunding initiative set up at truckerdefensefund.ca to provide free legal counsel, which we'll talk about that more in a bit. But today, as you can see in Ottawa with Marco, we spoke to him after his testimony as a witness who, as he mentioned, was subpoenaed to appear, to find out a little bit about how he feels coming out of it and what he's heard so far from the Public Order Emergency Commission. Now, before we jump to that interview, I'm just going to let you know, if you are unaware, the Public Order Emergency Commission was automatically determined to take place after the invocation of the Emergencies Act by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau,
which was formerly known as the War Measures Act, partly a counter-terrorism act which allows for the curtailing of civil liberties and the broadening of enforcement powers. In this case, used to dismantle the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, and allegedly for the countless demonstrations that were taking place across the nation during the same time frame. Though the evidence for its necessity is still outstanding, I should point out that we are seeing witnesses attest to the situation in Coutts and why it was relevant to the invocation of said Emergencies Act, even though the events of the Coutts Blockade had decidedly ended before its invocation by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
But right now, as I mentioned, we are here to talk to Marco, one of the individuals from the Coutts Blockade, to find out what his take is on the events of the Commission.
So was it your personal intention to block the border and not give up until all the mandates and restrictions were lifted, as is stated in this flyer?
It was never my intention to block the border. It was always our intention to create an inconvenience at the border in the afternoon of January the 29th. So I've been aware of this for quite some time. It's definitely a weight. It's definitely a stress. It's normal. It's not something any of us look to do. But under the circumstance, I felt obligated. I mentioned that before. There was a willingness, but I prepped myself for weeks. Almost months. I've been just reviewing the information, mentally preparing myself, but there's still the actual act of testimony, and that was for me the biggest stress as to the events and how would I do, and the questions and what are their goals. Going in the day of and the day before, going to Ottawa, things were good. I was pretty calm. We did some prep with Martin with Williamson Law. We talked to other individuals, I kept my mind off of it. I went in, and it went well. I walked off that stage, relieved, obviously, but also vindicated. I felt that I was able to share the message that I had showed up to bring, and that there was a lot of clarity brought forward. Things were clarified. My lawyers were also very happy with my testimony. I think we'll use happy. That's where we're at with this, and it was well received back home. There's always going to be things, looking back and listening to this testimony that I'll pick up on, but we shared the truth, we shared the message, and I've put it back into the hands of the commission to do their work.
And did you know that there were firearms amongst the protesters?
No.
Had you ever heard of this plot to shoot RCMP officers that they're being alleged to have, planned?
No.
Were your bank accounts frozen when the Emergencies Act was invoked?
No.
But I understand that you were recently arrested.
No, I've never been arrested since Coutts, or during and since Coutts. I was summoned to come in and have my charges read off to me, and a promise to appear.
So you have been charged, though?
I've been charged, but I've never been arrested.
Right. And that's for a mischief?
Mischief, yeah.
So that was in relation to the Coutts protests, but it was recent, and so it wasn't like an Emergencies Act measure, I guess.
I think has been established in the timelines that have been presented to the commission that the decision to wrap up the Coutts blockade happened well before, in senses, well before the invocation. How does that make you feel that there's still this talk of it being relevant to the Coutts blockade?
Well, there's those who want to salvage the situation. We all know that this was political gamemanship, and I think the public has already seen this. The commission will come to the conclusion that the Emergencies Act was not necessary. The powers of the Emergencies Act were not necessary to resolve any of the blockades, and possibly even Ottawa. But what will happen? What authority does the commission have? What will be the consequences for this abuse of power, if any? So that's where my participation, I was subpoenaed. Ottawa is that's the head of power for this country, but we have no connection to Ottawa. That news of the Emergencies Act coming out, I don't even recall hearing a whole lot about it, because the morning of the 14th we were dealing with the situation regarding these arrests and the decisions to peacefully leave the blockade, disassemble and leave the blockade. Ottawa played no part in that. We're Albertans, and we have respect for Ottawa and for what it's supposed to represent, but there was no bearing on the decisions made in Ottawa on our decision to leave.
Good afternoon. After the events of yesterday and the news released that the RCMP made arrests and come forward with, and the arrests resulted in long-arm firearms, handguns, and protective equipment being unearthed, we as the Coutts Convoy have decided that as a peaceful protest and to maintain that narrative, we will be rolling out tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Please come out tonight, support us, eat our food, socialize with all of us. We want to wrap this up in a peaceful way, and we thank everybody for all their support, for their prayers, and we hope that we have started something that will have such wide-reaching effects that governments will continue to go back to the grassroots, listen to the constituents, and that these mandates, these restrictive mandates will soon be eliminated.
I won't ask you about the specifics of the execution of warrants that took place around February 13th and 14th, but you alluded to the media coverage that took place afterwards as a large factor, and generally even though the charges still are before the courts, the charge of conspiracy to commit murder is a serious charge, right? How did you feel about the media's coverage of that execution of warrants?
The media is very polarizing and biased, and they built a story around essentially no facts. I understand there was a story there, but little by little, there's been details of disclosure that have come out, and they've taken that out of context at times. So I look, and we need to look to expedite this trial for these men. I'm not going to speak to their whether they're guilty or whether they're innocent. That's not my role. I'm not the judge. I'm not the jury, but they deserve a fair trial, a fair, timely trial by their peers. And the judicial system in Alberta at this moment is completely broken, and the abuse they are receiving due to this misinformation and the abuse their families take is unacceptable. And that's why I would stand up for their families and push for a fair trial where all the facts and the truth will come out. There was no groups that were previously engaged in anything that were part of this. It was, when I say groups, it would be, 6 people came from the town of Coaldale and they're familiar with each other and they drove in a convoy together, so they're going to band with each other if they're all sitting with individuals they don't know, right? You stick to your own until you become familiar with each other.
Right, so because it was like an organic protest, a sort of a grassroots movement with different people from all over Alberta, when she says splinter groups, you also don't know what she's referring to.
So when I think splinter groups, I think we're talking more in different positions, different views on where we were at that time in regards to the border or the highway was blockaded by multiple trucks, not just one. They may have had the perception that if one truck moved, traffic could flow, but essentially it was a combination of vehicles that created the inconvenience at that intersection.
You were alleged to be a key participant of this event, even though we hear from Brenda Lucky that there's these splinter cells, these specific groups. We heard from the testimony today that there were so many different groups of individuals all working towards the same means of, I guess you could say, support or in support of the Freedom Convoy. And Artur Pawlowski, another individual that's been mentioned, he was also faced with the charge of mischief for over $5,000, spent 51 days behind bars.
Yes, they wanted to know what is happening in Milk River. They wanted to know what is happening in Coutts, who are the main players over there, who is in charge, is there any leadership, who makes the decisions. And of course, I don't know anything about that because I'm not there. They make their own decisions. I am in this trouble because of my speech to them to hold the lines.
This little pitiful piece of land, and the eyes of the world are fixed right here on you guys. You are the heroes of the solidarity movement. Don't you dare breaking the line. The whole world is watching you. I was on 60 radio stations driving here, and Americans are saying this to us: when you're done with your tyrants, please come to America and help us do the revolution. Thousands of people are watching you right now, and they're coming tomorrow. You know that? Do you see what is happening outside? The people are bringing food, chili, soup, everything. There's so many people. I've never seen a movement as big as right now. And you've done that. You did it. Now you're going to pack your stuff, take your toys, and go to
Well, I'm actually kind of surprised. I mean, at the end of the day, we had never invited him to come as far as that part goes. He came out of his own free will, and the message wasn't necessarily, stand up against the government. That's not what his message was intended. So for there to be anything negatively pointed towards him doesn't really make any sense.
It was an organic movement. It wasn't organized. What I'm alleged to have been part of, it's very unfortunate that there's still prosecutions and that the provincial and federal governments are still looking to prosecute individuals, even though the events of COVID and the information around COVID and the experts that decided things regarding COVID got it wrong.
Now, as I mentioned before, Marco has now been charged with mischief over $5,000, along with Alex and George, the three individuals who RCMP alleged to be key participants of the blockade. Well, right now, Williamson Law, the legal defense that Rebel News is providing free by means of crowdfunding through truckerdefensefund.ca, is going to be fighting for these guys tooth and nail before the Crown. And if you want to help out their legal defense, you got to go to truckerdefensefund.ca. For Rebel News, Sydney Fizzard. truckerdefensefund.ca is where you have to go if you want to help support the three individuals who have now been charged with mischief over $5,000 stemming from their allegedly being key participants of the Coutts Blockade. Even though, as we've seen over the last few days, especially here at the Commission and talks of the blockade, there were a multitude of organizers, there were a multitude of people who were allegedly the key protesters at this demonstration. If, for some reason, Alex, Marco, and George have now been singled out. So if you want to help them, if you want to prevent them from possibly facing 10 years in prison as the max sentence for this charge of mischief over $5,000, you got to go to truckerdefensefund.ca.